Dr. Begbie, you were talking just a moment ago about the universal meaning that music has the ability to communicate, that it can say things that words simply can't, that are beyond the reach of language, whether that's in a moment of joy or in a moment of profound sorrow. And you mentioned also how we use music in the expression of theology to bring out aspects of the words themselves that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to fully communicate. I mean, I think of a hymn like "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And if you just put the words out there, I mean, they're fine words, but when you combine it with that tune, as Luther did, it's like it's a whole different experience, because you can feel the strength. You
can feel the
God.
mightiness. You can feel the mightiness. Absolutely,
feel the mightiness of the fortress, right? But there's this other method that you talk about where you say that we can also, instead of just starting with theology and then adding music, that we can begin with music and then draw theological truth out of that. And you call this music for theology, I think is the way you've put it. What do you mean by that? And then what would be some of the possibilities we could explore, given the fact that music doesn't refer directly to things the way words do?
This I first came aware of when I was teaching theology here in Cambridge, as a matter of fact, in a seminary. That over and over again, I found myself using musical language, and if there was a piano there, I would use it very naturally, because I was thinking and behaving like a musician, the way I do. And musicians who are listening to this will know that very well. They process a lot of the world through music. And I began to see that when I did that, I could get through to things that are there, say, in the New Testament, in a much, it's often quicker, but also, I think, sometimes profounder way than if I used language on its own. It's very important to say this does not mean you run away from the words of the Bible. Some people get nervous at this point and thinking you're making music into a kind of independent source of divine revelation. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that when you stay with Scripture, read it, get inside it, you are oriented towards the living God. And as you are oriented, there are all sorts of other things that will help you live into that orientation much more fully. Now, it could be visual art, it could be sculpture, it could be dance, it could be all sorts of things, but it can also be music. So it's not the music's taking you away from Scripture, it's helping you penetrate more deeply and understand more deeply what's going on there. Now, perhaps the most striking example of that I discovered early on was concerning the Trinity. That music, the way we hear music, is very different from the way we see the world. The way we hear any sound, actually, but let's say music just for the moment. What happens when I hear a note, if I play a note on a piano, what I hear fills the whole of my heard space. Notes don't occupy bounded locations in what we hear. We don't say a note is there, but it's not there. What we hear fills the whole of our heard space. And if you add another note to that first, and I just played two notes on a piano, the second note fills the same heard space. It doesn't occupy a bounded location with an edge to it. It fills the whole of that space. But it's the same space as the first note. So in the world that we hear, two things can be in the same place at the same time. Now, the world you see, that's not possible. If a painter puts red on a space on a canvas and then comes along with a pot of yellow paint and tries to put yellow in the same space, it'll hide the red, or if the paint's wet, it'll get orange. You can't see two things in the same place at the same time as different. And that's just the way we see the world. But the way we hear the world is quite different. We can have two things in the same place at the same time. And, of course, if you add a third note, then you've got three notes in the same space at the same time. What's more, and what's so interesting about that is that with, say, three notes on a piano, those three strings will be resonating with each other. They will set each other off. They don't occupy bounded locations. There's something called sympathetic resonance going on. So they're actually enhancing each other as you hear them. Now, if we go to the Trinity, it seems to me that a huge number of problems in thinking about the Trinity have arisen because we've relied too much on our eyes. Nothing wrong with vision, but if we over-rely on one sensory mode, like vision, if we over-rely, we're likely to get into all sorts of trouble. So typically with the Trinity, you get the heresy of a kind of Unitarianism on the one hand, where all threeness is gone, or you have tritheism, where you've got threeness, but you haven't got oneness. And there are all sorts of other variations. But usually, if you look at what people try to do with the Trinity, they're thinking visually. I've heard hundreds of Trinity Sunday sermons. In my tradition, we have a thing called the Trinity Sunday, when we suddenly believe in the Trinity for 1 week. And then we all go back to believing in the one God again. And typically in those sermons, you have people bringing out visual illustrations. Drain pipes and rabbit's ears and cat's whiskers and all sorts of other fascinating stuff, which of course, what you're telling your congregation is this is a problem to be solved, and I'm going to solve it with visual illustrations. But a simple 3-note chord does all the work for you almost instantly, and it's also quite pleasurable to listen to. Now, if you go back to John's Gospel, say, you'll see the Father is in the Son is in the Father. Very hard to draw. Very hard to visualize, but very easy to hear when you just play 2 notes together. All that in one anotherness language you get in John's Gospel of Father and Son, which of course is the beginnings of the Trinity in the New Testament, right? All that in one anotherness language begins to open out. And you have a very different way of beginning to understand the inner life of God. So the reason I chose that example is because that's a matter of reading Scripture more profoundly. Trinity is not just a doctrine, it derived from Scripture. We're talking about the very being of God. And so I found music in that case can help people, as I say, penetrate, understand more deeply, enter into more fully what the Bible is trying to tell us. And actually it goes much wider than that. There's all sorts of other things that this sonic perception brings to light, or rather brings to our ears in Scripture. But that's enough for the moment. That's what I mean by music for theology. And I found, actually, just using this very thing of the 3-note chord in schools, in churches, atheists, agnostics. I was once asked by a very distinguished composer, a British composer, who had to give a talk on music and religion in Asia, somewhere in Asia he had to go, and he heard that I'd worked on this, and he was a very virulent atheist, completely, but he said, I've got to speak about music and religion. Have you any ideas? I said, well, so we sort of chatted away, and eventually I said, have you ever thought of the way we hear music and how distinctive it is? And I talked about just what I've talked with you about, 2 or 3 notes, and he stopped, and his mouth hung open. He said, I've never ever thought of that before. And then he said, doesn't that kind of have something to do with this Trinity thing that you Christians talk about? I said, funny you should say that. Funny you should say it. So there, after 6 minutes of conversations, we were talking about the Trinity. Now, no apologetics book will ever tell you to introduce the Trinity early in a conversation, because it'll confuse them and all the rest of it. This guy was already getting the point. He was already, and then I could talk about the love of God, the fact that Trinity, ultimately what's at stake is God a God of love at his heart. So it was an extraordinary conversation with someone who, in so many ways, was immune, is that right, almost vaccinated against anything Christian or religious. Suddenly we were talking about the very heart, the heart of the faith. I had a similar conversation with an imam from Cairo once, I remember, who came to Cambridge to do some work on Islamic and Christian theology. And we talked about precisely these things. And we had a very different kind of conversation from the usual sort of conversation you get about the Trinity. Is this tritheism? Is it Unitarianism? Is it, how can you be a monotheist and still believe in the Trinity? All those things, which are very, very big issues in interfaith conversation, suddenly look very different when you approach them through music. Or just the way we hear the world. God's given us these ears. Let's, if it's not confusing things, let's listen to them.
Right. Listen through them.
And listen through
to
them
the
better. Thank you.
experience that we have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And reflect on the experience and how extraordinarily distinctive it is in a world that's
Isn't it
so
interesting?
easily dominated by visual media.